Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joe Platt. I am a state legislative manager for Giffords, the gun violence prevention organization founded by former Congresswoman Gabby Giffords. I'm really excited to be here. I am not a Wisconsinite, but I am very excited about this next speaker because you guys seem to think it's a good idea to have an election every year that tries to give me a heart attack. So I'm very good at refreshing that polling webpage. Our next speaker is a nationally recognized government scholar and pollster. Charles Franklin has been the director of the Marquette Law School poll since its inception in 2012. Under Franklin's direction, the poll became the largest independent polling project in state history. It accurately captured voter attitudes before every major election in 2012, including the gubernatorial recall, U.S. Senate race, and presidential race. Since joining Marquette as a professor of law and public policy in August 2013, Franklin has used the poll to continue tracking political races of interest to voters and explore additional public policy issues. Please welcome Charles to the stage.
Well, today I'm the second Charles to speak. I guess if we can get the third, it'll be the King of England. So if you see somebody walking in soon. I've been waiting my whole life for that guy to finally become king, you know. So my job is to talk to you about public opinion on guns, because some of that, as the 80% coalition says, is good news from your point of view. But I want to show you the bad news as well, because you know, public opinion is not the whole ball game. Your organizing and efforts matter tremendously in any kind of movement to affect public policy. But public opinion is a critical background issue, or so I think at least. So I want to walk you through what some of these data show, both here in Wisconsin and nationally. This morning at 12:01 a.m., we released a new national poll on guns and other issues, but for our purposes, guns. But we've also been polling about guns and gun policy in Wisconsin for a long time. So in my talk, I'm going to freely mix the national and the state data, fundamentally because the state public opinion is rarely very different from what national opinion is. So anything I say today about national opinion probably lines up well in the state as well. So here's the number one thing. 80% plus that favor, I'm going to keep calling it a red flag law for convenience, and because I already made the slides. I should say that in our question, we include the point that a judge or a court has approved an order so that the due process concerns are addressed in the question wording, because those do come up. But what you see is over 80% supporting that kind of court-sanctioned red flag law. You can see, and we're going to spend a little time on this. So the sort of beige-colored bars are overall public opinion. Then the red, purple, and blue for Republicans, independents, and Democrats. Every chart I'm going to show you except the last two are divided up this way by partisanship, as well as the beige line showing overall opinion. Okay, so now we're ready to go through a bunch of slides. But a point I want to make is about allies, and I'm going to mention it a couple of times. I'm going to come back to that point at the end. But pay attention to where the purple lines are, or bars are, because those are the independents that aren't as wrapped up in partisan affairs, and sometimes they share opinions with Republicans, who are almost always more reticent, though not in this case, but more reticent about gun policy. But sometimes independents lean with the Democrats. And so watch that, because it sort of says whether pro-gun violence suppression or control shares a sort of majority opinion and has a natural ally in these in-between folks. Here, of course, the mystery is why, with such massive support across party lines, this is not just a no-brainer. But that is, again, I don't need to preach to the choir here. This is exactly the problem, that public opinion alone does not move legislation or move policy. You need other things like organizing and finding allies and working with them. Okay, but on red flag laws, there's just really not much of a minority opinion on that, except in the sort of gun rights movement that opposes these for a variety of reasons. How about universal background checks? Very similar. Again, we're up into the 80% range. I didn't say it, but if you look at the subtitle, you'll see it says Wisconsin surveys here. The previous one said national surveys, just so you can keep that straight. Again, 80% support background checks. A big majority, not quite 80% of Republicans are on board with that. I'm not going to go into gun owners, but in both of these two slides, it's big majorities of gun owners also support these kinds of laws. But here's an example of something that you might think would be universally known, and it's actually not. Just recently, we had this tragic series of events with a young man knocking on the wrong door in Kansas City and being shot. A day or two later, a young woman was killed when she drove up the wrong driveway in New York. Having those two out, we saw a series of similar things. A basketball rolls into a neighbor's yard and a shooting follows. So in a sense, these are hardly unique events. When you start looking for them, you see this kind of arbitrary violence happening all the time. But the door knock case got exceptionally wide coverage, as did the next day or two shooting in the driveway. But if you look on the far left, this is our national survey that just came out. It's only about 45%, less than half of the public said they'd heard a lot about those two things. Then it's 37% and heard a little, and 18% heard nothing at all. In other words, these very dramatic events that if you pay attention to this, as I do, I'm sure you do, you would think everybody knows about this. But in fact, less than half really paid much attention to it. You also see now a little bit of a partisan difference. Democrats much more likely to have heard a lot. Part of this is a matter of we hear and pay attention to messages we want to believe, and we ignore messages or news stories about things that are not on the side that we want to believe. And so you'll see this happen repeatedly, that if the message is something congenial to Republican viewpoints, Republicans will hear more about it, believe it's more important, and vice versa for Democrats when it goes the other way. That does have some implications for who has heard your message. I joked a moment ago about preaching to the choir. You go to a Democratic audience and you'll find an enormous number of people that have heard about things like this and are very concerned about it. You go to a Republican audience, it's a harder sell. What about concern about gun violence? These are a series of questions we asked throughout the 2022 campaign here in the state. And what you can see is pretty high concern about gun violence, 58%, very concerned, and then it drops off with lower levels of concern. But a big partisan gap, very high concern with Democrats, still over 40% with Republicans, so it's not like Republicans are not concerned, but relatively speaking, they're considerably less concerned. But then you may have heard more about, there we go, crime, because goodness knows you couldn't have watched a TV commercial in the fall and not seen something about crime. But notice that the very concern about crime is the same level as the very concern about gun violence. But who's concerned on this slide? It's Republicans much more concerned. Now, check me if I'm wrong, but I kind of think gun violence and crime are maybe somehow related to one another. But you frame this in a Republican perspective and you get one answer. You frame it in a Democratic perspective, you get a very different answer in concern. How do you communicate that, and how might you blend these two in a way that started to get both sides a little more concerned about both of these issues? And, you know, part of it's labeling, part of it's political rhetoric. But it does show this overall level. Now, here's one of the punchlines here. You would think from both of these two things that everybody should be very afraid all the time. And the commercials certainly wanted to make you very afraid all the time. But when we changed the question about how concerned are you about crime in your community, look how much lower the very concerned bars are. And look at how modest the partisan differences are. It's very much, I'm scared to death of those scary folks down the road. But hey, I'm fine. I don't lock my doors at night. Not quite, but close. And so, again, this context of how we think about crime and gun violence and safety where you actually live as opposed to where you're scared of, those are big deals. Now, here in Milwaukee, we found that concern about crime was much higher in the city than it was in Madison or Green Bay or Eau Claire. But concern in the suburbs of Milwaukee were just as high as in the city. I think maybe one answer to that is local TV news. Everybody in the city and in the suburbs sees the same scary, if it bleeds, it leads kind of news coverage. And I don't really mean to bash the media. They're having enough troubles without me piling on. But I do think it shows how much perceptions are driven maybe by news coverage. And I think the assumptions in the fall in the campaign was that this fear of crime was sort of universal around the state and could motivate people around the state. But it really turns out that that fear is a lot lower outside the Milwaukee media market, meaning the city and the suburbs, than it is in Madison, Green Bay, La Crosse, Eau Claire, and so on in other parts of the state. So it's not a universal fear. And again, if you talk about your lived experience in your community, there are some people that are very afraid and honestly really should be afraid because they live in very bad conditions. And we're working awfully hard to try to address those things. Not me, I don't do anything but ask questions. But you guys here at the front table at least are doing that. So I just want to stress that it's easy to generalize this and think that everybody has the same views, but they're very different. They're different by geography. They're different by race and age and education, a variety of things we're not going to get to. What about coming back to some policy issues? What about extending the Second Amendment? This is the Supreme Court case from last summer that expanded the right to possess a gun to outside the home. Earlier court rulings had said people can have a firearm in their home for protection, but didn't address the question about whether states were more or less required to issue permits for outside the home possession. Here is a case where a solid 40% favor that expansion of gun rights outside the home. You can see a big party difference. Republicans much more in favor. Democrats much less in favor. But look over here to the right, and fully 30% of the public had no opinion about this issue, even right after the Supreme Court ruled that there was some right to possession outside the home. And so, as the issue is a real issue, the court's ruling opens the door for a variety of federal rulings, some of which are already beginning to take place. This is one of the fundamental problems. It goes back to what I said about only 45% had heard of the wrong door shooting. Only 30%, or as much as 30%, haven't heard about this Supreme Court ruling changing policy. Here's another one. Has the Supreme Court expanded the rights of gun owners over the last few years? Here you see 41% say that they have expanded those rights. About 25% say not so much, and about 34% say that really hadn't changed very much over time. This is one where there was opinion change. When we asked these questions before the Bruin case was decided, that's the one that expanded rights last summer, fewer people thought that they'd expanded rights. More people said they'd kept it about the same. And actually, that's pretty close to right over the last decade and a half, where right in the home was there, but not outside the home. But here I'm showing you only the surveys we've done since the Bruin decision, and there is an increase in the perception that gun rights have expanded. But even despite that increase, we're still at 34% haven't heard about that, or don't think much has changed, even though I think pretty clearly something changed last summer. Here's another policy question. Should we raise the minimum age to buy a handgun to 21? Here we have a little bit over 50% support for that, pretty big partisan divide. This is one of those issues that may actually, in fact, a federal court ruled on the federal age limit just in the last month. So this is something that is coming down the pike. But there is substantial support, but it's nowhere close to the 80% support. That's, you're going to be able to get the slides after this, so you can see the numbers. You don't have to jot them all down, and it won't be on the exam. But from 80% to the 60s to here, just a little over 50% support. Be aware that these things are not uniformly hugely popular. There is real variation. What about banning the sales of AR-15 style assault weapons or semi-automatic weapons? We again see pretty substantial support of that, but it's not 80%. I believe the number is still 9 states that have a state ban on assault-style weapons. So it's a small number of states. I believe it was Washington State that just enacted a AR-15 ban in the last few months. But substantial support on that, and actually it's a minority, but it's still 43% of Republicans on that issue. So maybe there'll be little movement on that, maybe not. But here's the worst news of all. Would new gun policies actually reduce gun violence? And very few people think it would have a big impact. Only a modest number say it would have some moderate impact. Most people are in the no impact at all, or a little impact. And this, to me, seems to be one of the big barriers. It's true across a lot of policy domains that we've really lost our confidence that government policy can affect any kind of change effectively. And it shows up here very clearly. So yes, we have all this support for all these policies. But if you don't explain to the public with maybe some actual evidence that some of these policies are actually more than just window dressing, more than things that sound good but might actually have an impact, and explain why they have an impact and why we know that they have an impact. I think all of those things are really important to moving people from saying, wow, I'd really wish we didn't have AR-15s, to actually thinking getting rid of them would make some difference, some important difference. So that's partly messaging, it's partly evidence, and frankly, it's also partly concentrating on the things that might have a bigger impact and staying away from the things that might sound good but really are unlikely to have much of an impact. In any case, talk about those things. I wanted to talk a little bit about gun owners real quickly because in the fall, in 2 surveys in October, we asked Wisconsin gun owners some things about their possession and use of guns. So what we found is that the biggest group say they have a gun for hunting. Well over 60%. Interestingly, Democrats who own guns are especially likely to use those guns for hunting. Now, these are not exclusive. People could say, I have it for hunting, I have it for target practice, I have it for other things. But Democrats really apparently love to hunt in Wisconsin. But Republicans are pretty big on hunting as well. What about home protection? This is I have a gun in my nightstand, or I have a gun at home in case somebody comes to my house. Pretty strong percentage that say they have the gun for that purpose. Republicans now more likely to say it's for home protection. Democrats considerably less, again, among gun owners we're talking about. What about for personal protection outside the home? This is Much lower, but still 25% say they have a gun for that purpose. Now, you could assume that concealed carry folks are in this category especially, but we didn't ask if they have a concealed carry license, so I don't know that for sure. But it's still 1 in 4 Wisconsin gun owners who say they have this weapon for protection outside the home, to which I leap to the conclusion that that probably means they carry their gun with them in one form or another, because not much help if you leave it at home. Partisan differences again here, but notice that even among Republicans, it's still a substantial minority who say they have the gun for outside the home protection. So I think this is a pretty big deal, but it's not one where Republicans are vastly more likely to say they want it for outside the home protection, though they are considerably more likely to say they want it for protection in the home. So there's a difference there, and it's a difference of policy of whether folks have guns out in their cars and on the streets or not, or whether they have them at home. If they have them at home, what did they do with them? Well, the good news is more than half of them say they lock them in a gun safe. And another 20 or 25% say that they keep them in some other form of secure storage at home, whatever that means to them, but they're clearly thinking about security. But then we get about a quarter of the people who say they don't lock up any of their guns, or they lock up some, but they keep some for ready use. That's the gun and the night table. Charles's excellent statistics on this. We didn't coordinate, but they fit rather nicely together. If you think about gun safety and the suicide rates we see, not so much in your data, but the accidental shootings that occur in the home as well, a lot of that could be modified at least through gun safes or secure lockups, at the very least, to keep kids and others from getting to them. But at the most, maybe preventing some suicides by introducing a delay. There is, I just want to say, an effort, I believe it's a proposal in the legislature, but I don't know its status right now, to support gun shops taking weapons and locking them up securely from gun owners who are going through a mental health crisis. And I think that is, I'm not an expert on this, but that's a chance for an alliance that could potentially make a difference in the suicide rate, which we saw is very high. And it would be an ally with a gun-owning, gun-using community that normally doesn't partner with folks that are concerned about other issues of gun safety. But it's worth thinking about because it affects those gun owners very much. And I think concern about mental health, suicidal thoughts, the growth of deaths by depression and other kinds of things is well worth thinking about from a policy point of view. Now we're back to everybody. Concealed carry. This was a big issue here in Wisconsin. It was passed and vetoed a couple of times. When we first started polling on this issue in 2012, opinion was split. It was like 48% opposed, 46% in favor of a concealed carry permit with a license. That support has grown over the years and now is solidly in the 60% range. You can see in this national data yesterday, it's a little over 60% in Wisconsin. It's fluctuated between 60 and 65 or so percent in favor. So there really has been a big change in this from 2012 to now. And you can see, again, partisan split is quite big, but the main point here is that the public is not on the side of doing away with concealed carry with a license. What's the new thing is concealed carry without a license, what I'm going to call permitless or no license concealed carry. Here, opinion is vastly opposed to laws that allow you to carry a concealed weapon with no permit, no need for training or safety instruction or anything. It's about 20% nationally. In Wisconsin, we've asked this question 2 or 3 times, and it's been 18 to 20% in favor of that. But as of today, 25 states have no permit concealed carry laws. Florida will join that list in July as the 26th state. The 25 today are half the states, but they make up about 30% of the population in the country. With Florida, that percentage of the population will bump up a bit. But it's a very unpopular policy. You can see overall here at the national and the state level. But what about opinion on this issue now I've switched colors on you. The green bar now are the states that allow no permit carry. And opinion in those 25 states is just 30% in favor of that law and 69% opposed to the very law that those folks live with. Okay? And that's a stunning thing. Now, there is higher support for it in the no permit states than there are in the other two kinds of states that have more restrictive carry policies. But you might think, at least in my mind, Tennessee pops up and you think, wow, everybody in Tennessee must want no permit carry. I don't know about Tennessee specifically, but you look at these data and it's probably the case that in most of these states, that policy is far from majority support. But fly in the ointment. We know what state you live in when we're doing the survey. We ask, what is the law in your state? Do you think the law in your state is no permit, or is a permit required, or do you not know? Less than half of the people in no permit states know that that's the law in their state, 45%. So about 22% erroneously believe that you have to have a permit there. But 34%, frankly, say, no, I don't know what the gun law is here. So if I could tally these again, how many people had heard about the door knock shootings? How many people had heard about the change in the Supreme Court ruling on guns? How many people even know that they live in a state where anybody can do concealed carry with no regulation in effect? I slightly overstate the case, but not by much. This is one of those barriers. It's not enough to have 80% on your side, as with the no license concealed carry, if more than half of the people don't realize what they live with. And so those messaging issues are truly important to get these issues not just, oh, well, yeah, I support you, but to understand how important they are, how they affect you. And then that other question, can the policies you're proposing actually make a difference in these things? Because why should I be involved in this issue if they don't make a difference in the end? Oops. Now that's really funny. There it is. I got to give you a reading assignment. It was supposed to have come before that last slide. This is not public opinion, but it's political mobilizing. Corinne McConaughey wrote this wonderful book on women's suffrage. The suffrage movement languished for decades without making much progress before 100 years ago finally succeeding. And the point that McConaughey makes in her book is that the suffrage movement started to have successes when, I'll come to you in just a second, when it found alliances with other groups not directly involved with suffrage, but where they could make common cause. And I just wanted to push this point a little bit. If you find another organization that absolutely shares your views on every element of guns, and you make an alliance with them, that's fine, but you really haven't expanded the pool of people on this. If you can find an alliance with somebody not normally your ally, but you have at least some element of common cause that has the potential, at least, it's easy to say, hard to do, but it has the potential, at least, for expanding the possibilities for influencing legislation and policy there. Her book is just a lovely example of how that worked with the suffrage movement, but I think you could carry it over to the guns issue and to any other issue, honestly, about what does it take to make those alliances to pay off? So I guess I'll go back to here for the final slide. Thank you so much.